Hello and welcome. I'm going to be trying something a little new here for me. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a retro gaming PC that I recently built, and we are going to be comparing this in several games to the Xbox 360. This card right here is an ATI Radeon X1900 XTX. For a very short time in 2006, this was the most powerful graphics card that money could buy, more or less. The reason why I'm comparing this to an Xbox 360 is because the graphics chip on the Xbox 360 was based on the architecture for the graphics chip on this card here. The specs for the rest of the computer I'm using are an AMD Athlon 64X2 4200 Plus with 3 GB of DDR2 memory on 2 mismatched sticks. I'm also using a 250 GB Maxtor hard drive from around the time this hardware was new on a SATA interface. And I'm going to be running Windows XP on this computer. The games I'm going to be comparing this with are Gears of War, Oblivion, Assassin's Creed, Crysis, and Need for Speed Most Wanted. So anyway, onto the graphics card itself. As you can see, it has 48 pixel shaders, 8 vertex shaders, 16 TMUs and 16 ROPs, with 512 megabytes of GDDR3 memory for the VRAM. This card launched at a price of $400, so it was nearly as costly as the entire Xbox 360 console itself. It also runs at 600 MHz, and it is very comparable to the graphics card on the Xbox 360 with one very important change. See, those 48 pixel shaders and 8 vertex shaders are important. You might wonder, what is a shader? Well, this is just a component in the graphics card responsible for producing the effects in games, anything from lighting to the way water looks, anything like that that doesn't have to do with just, you know, traditional polygons and textures. And when they made the Xbox 360 graphics chip, they changed these pixel and vertex shaders into unified shaders. So this is important because since the PC graphics card only has 8 vertex shaders, if you're playing a game that makes heavy use of vertex shader effects, all of the load for that will fall on those 8 vertex shaders, and the pixel shaders will simply have to sit idle, unable to do anything. The Xbox 360's graphics chip has 48 unified shaders, and these are analogous to the stream processors on a modern AMD card, or CUDA cores on a modern NVIDIA card. And this unified shader approach was adopted later in 2006 on the next generation of ATI and NVIDIA cards, Terascale for ATI and the GeForce 8000 series for NVIDIA. Other than that, this graphics chip is clocked about 100 MHz slower, but more or less it is very similar in specification to the graphics chip on the PC card, and it makes for a very interesting point of comparison. The only other real difference in spec between the 360 and this computer is that the 360 uses a triple-core PowerPC CPU rather than the dual-core x86 CPU, and it has a lot less RAM because it doesn't have to run a full operating system, but it still does use a modified version of the Windows XP kernel. So anyway, let's go ahead and get this graphics card in the PC here, so we can go ahead and begin the comparison between this computer and an Xbox 360. Alright, just a quick word before we begin here. just to go over some of the basics of what I'm doing here. This is not going to be a super scientific comparison. As you can see, this is over a standard definition video signal, and that's just because I don't really have an HD capture device, and this is the easiest way for me to do it. All games in this on Windows XP will be running at a resolution of 1024 by 768, although you're only seeing the 480i output of the graphics card. They are being downscaled and running internally at 1024 by 768. This is just the easiest way for me to do it, and makes it kind of a fair comparison between both pieces of hardware. So anyway, starting off with Oblivion here. I'm running this game at all ultra settings at 1024 by 768. You see we got a nice fast load time there, not even using an SSD. This is a game from when Bethesda games were actually visually impressive. You can see this was the first Elder Scrolls game where you could really see into the distance. Morrowind had a big world, but a lot of the geometry and engine limited how far you could see. And you can see there's a nice amount of detail on the rocks there, good use of normal maps and everything, and the game runs pretty smoothly too, especially considering that this graphics card came out multiple months before this game's release. If you get a little close to certain objects, you can kind of see the 2006 in this, but it is a very good looking game in my opinion, even to this day. I always thought the combat in this game was really goofy looking though. Anyway, moving on to the Xbox 360, and the first thing I want to highlight here is the loading times take a lot longer. Now, Xbox 360 games all give you an option to install to the hard drive, but I'm playing on a 360 that doesn't have a hard drive, so it just has to load from the DVD. And keep in mind, this is a second generation 360 Slim, so yeah, DVD loading is just very slow. But as soon as we get into the game world, it becomes immediately apparent that it's a little bit less detailed than the PC version. Still very good looking, but you can tell it loses something a little bit, especially on some of the LOD textures really far in the distance. Another thing that you might be able to pick up on is that the game kind of runs at a much lower frame rate. And you'll see that in a second on the side-by-side comparison. Other than that, it gives you an experience that is very similar to playing on a high-end PC, which must have been very nice for a $500 console at the time. This game was supposed to be a launch game for the Xbox 360, but since it is such a massive game, it did have to be delayed by several months in order to come out simultaneously on the 360 and the PC. And a PS3 port also came out about a year later, and it was much better than Bethesda's other PS3 ports. Seeing the side-by-side comparison here, you can see that the PC version just overall has much better detail and simply runs more smoothly. People do accuse this game of being made primarily for consoles, but you can probably tell that this game was mainly developed with very high-end PCs in mind, and was probably one of the last Bethesda games that you could have really said that for. Yeah, if you get close to any objects on the 360 version, you can tell that it uses a lot less normal maps and some lower quality textures overall. Alright, moving on here, now we have Assassin's Creed. I'm actually a really big fan of this game. It's the only Assassin's Creed game I've ever beaten, and I just like the setting and the political undertones of it. But anyway, to talk a little bit about the PC version of this game, they improved some things about it, and some things got a little worse. The main thing is that this version of the game is somewhat less well optimized than the 360 version that it was ported from, and as such I have lowered the settings here to low and medium settings, just so that the game would be sort of pleasant to look at, because with all of the settings turned up to where they are in the 360, the frame rate just stays around the low teens most of the time. But they did make some gameplay related changes to this game, including increasing the variety of the missions and making the gameplay a lot less monotonous. If you didn't like the game on the consoles, you might like the game a little better on the PC. I should probably check out the other Assassin's Creed games, because I hear those are a lot better, but I think this one is a fine game. And anyway, moving on to the 360 version, and you can immediately tell that the lighting effects are a lot better. Most of the geometry and the textures are the same as what I have on the PC there, but there's just a lot more detail in the lighting and better shadows. Yeah, I guess you could say this is a somewhat unfair comparison, and this isn't necessarily because the 360 is better, this is just because the 360 version of this game is better optimized, because this game was developed mainly for the 360, then it was ported over to the other platforms. For a game that came out in 2007, though, I think that it is pretty impressive looking on both platforms, especially when you take that large open world into consideration. And this isn't just like an open field, it's a giant city with a lot of people that react to what you do. It is a very impressive game for the time. I do kind of get the feeling that this game just gets a lot of slack because the later games in the series were a lot better. Anyway, the side-by-side here, you can see that with the settings that I'm using on the PC, it is a lot less impressive looking, although the performance is a little bit better than the 360 version in some areas to compensate. Other than that though, like I said, the geometry detail and the textures are roughly equivalent on both platforms. I think it's a fine experience either way you play, and obviously the optimization doesn't matter much on a modern graphics card, but anything lower than a GeForce GTX 400 card, and yeah, it won't run that well. But anyway, moving on to Gears of War here, starting out on the PC, you can see that this offers a pretty cool experience. So to talk a little bit about this PC version, once you get into the actual game, everything runs fine, but unfortunately this is one of those games for Windows Live games, and a lot of bullshit comes with it, not the least of which is that without a patch, this game basically has an expiration date. Now if you're playing this on like a Windows 10 computer, you can just download a patch, but my computer isn't connected to the internet, so in order to play the game, I had to set my system clock to before June 2008, which was kind of annoying. But yeah, other than that, this is a pretty good looking game on the PC. You can see that, you know, this game's just full of detail and lighting, and I mean, it was one of the first games that kind of started the trend of everything being like really dark and muddy, and that lasted for a few years, and it was kind of annoying, but this game itself, I just like it a lot. It's got a lot of good action in it. and it was one of the first really big games to use Unreal Engine 3. And moving on to the Xbox 360 version here, you're going to see that it offers much the same experience, although for some reason on the 360 this game is like a lot lighter for some reason. Like, I'm not sure, maybe I could have played around with the gamma settings a little bit more, but yeah, this game is just a lot more bright on the 360. I think it is somewhat less detailed, especially in terms of textures. That's just because my PC here has a lot more video memory to play with, but, you know, overall, still a fine experience. And, yeah, moving on here, it's just... yeah, I don't know, something about it is just weirdly bright compared to the PC version. And I think there's also a lot less detail when it comes to things like light shafts, because when I was on the PC version, I was playing with a mixture of medium-high settings. So on the side-by-side here, you can see that, yeah, pretty much like the PC has some more detailed light shafts. I think it has better textures, but it's kind of hard to tell with this video output. And for some reason it is kind of just weirdly dark. If you're playing this game on modern Windows with a modern card, it also has some DirectX 10 features, but since I was just on Windows XP with an X1900, I get an experience that is very similar to playing the game on an Xbox 360. Now this one here is just going to be a quick one, but here is Need for Speed Most Wanted, the 2005 version. And on the PC here, you can see that it is a pretty good looking game for the time. It's got a lot of bloom, it's got some pretty nice shadows and detailed car models, a detailed environment. It's just overall a very nice looking game. And it's a fun racing game from when those sort of open-world street racing games were popular. I never played this one too much, but I have played a lot of Midnight Club 3, and I do like this style of game very much. Now, over here on the Xbox 360 version, you can see that there is a noticeable increase in the quality of lighting and shadows, as well as some HDR effects that weren't really on the PC version, and a slightly more detailed road. This was a high-profile launch title for the 360, so it received some special attention that the PC version did not, plus most people didn't have PC hardware that was comparable to the 360 at the time. They're both pretty similar experiences though, and they both offer a better experience than the 6th generation consoles. Here we have the big one, and that is Crysis. I saved this one for last because this is always the one that you want to see when running a PC of this era. And as you can see, it is running pretty good here at 1024 by 768 on all medium settings. You know, it's not exactly the same experience as running a Core 2 quad with an 8800 GT, but it's a more than playable experience that gives you the complete Crysis experience here. Now for this, I had to, since I was playing it on a TV, I had to play with a controller, so excuse my poor aim here, but as you can see, the physics works pretty well on this dual-core CPU I've got. And overall, it's just a fine experience, a lot of dense foliage and good textures. And it's just a really interesting game. Probably the best looking game of this era, and definitely the best looking game on this whole test. and one of the only games from this era that wasn't, you know, drenched in brown and gray tones. It actually had some variety to the color scheme. Yeah, you can see here it has a really fun physics system to mess with. I like that, how you can just shoot at a tree and it'll break exactly where you shot it. I played through this whole game recently on my modern PC and it was really fun. Now the 360 version here is pretty interesting because this was ported 4 years after the original game came out, and you can see it's much better looking. It seems to have much more dense foliage, but other than that, the geometry and texture detail is roughly the same, but has much better lighting effects. And that's because this is basically running in the Crysis 2 engine. They made a lot of tweaks to this game to make it a lot better, a lot easier to play on consoles. The 360 controls are a lot better. It has some auto aim that works a lot better. It's not quite the same as playing on a high-end PC with a mouse and keyboard, but if you were playing this on a 360 back in the day and you didn't have a gaming PC, it was definitely a pretty cool way to experience Crysis, and it preserves most of the original game with all of that, you know, the detail on the physics, the large levels. I mean, it is Crysis with some changes here and there to make it more suitable for consoles. They also went through and gave it some much more optimized shader code, and the 360's unified shaders definitely help with that a lot. So, in some ways, this is actually a better experience than playing on a PC of the same era, and the physics system works just as well on that triple-core PowerPC CPU. Just a really cool game, no matter how you choose to play it. And if you're playing it on the Xbox One, through the backwards compatibility, it works even better. See, on the side-by-side comparison, you can see that the 360 definitely has the advantage, but the PC version is still a pretty cool experience. That's just the benefit of running on that Crysis 2 engine there. If you haven't played this game, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's a great game outside of just gawking at the graphical detail. And that just about wraps everything up for now. So, I hope that this has been a fun and entertaining watch for some chill 2000s nostalgia. I've had a lot of fun using this PC for all kinds of stuff, especially games from the early 2000s, because this game does have a lot of backwards compatibility with stuff from the Windows 95 and 98 era onward. It's just a really cool PC to use for that sort of thing, and it can go pretty far into the future as well. This thing ran Mirror's Edge pretty well, you know, Crysis of course at medium settings. I beat Wolfenstein 2009 on this thing. I mean, this thing can play AAA games basically all the way up to 2010, and you know, it's just a really cool computer to use, and I'm probably going to use it to make even more videos in the future. But anyway, one thing that I really kind of wanted to go over real quick about this PC is that there's kind of been a lot of buzz going around the PC gaming community lately about how the PS5 might be equivalent or better than a high-end gaming PC, and I think what I want this to demonstrate is that there might be a kernel of truth to that. I mean, obviously, it won't be that way forever, and it's very likely that after a few months there will be much better hardware out there than the PS5, but it might take years for you to be able to build a $500 computer that can match the PS5 when you could just get the $500 PS5. Because, yeah, when the 360 came out, it was $500, and this graphics card was $400, so for a while, the 360 was much more valuable than a high-end gaming PC, and it stayed that way for years. So, you know, when you hear that the PS5 is going to be better in some ways than a high-end gaming PC. I wouldn't completely write that off, especially with that SSD architecture that Sony has come up with, where they can access the storage without having to use the CPU. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. You know, I'm not exactly Digital Foundry here, and this hasn't exactly been scientific, but, you know, I hope it's at least been entertaining, and if there's any information here that's incomplete or inaccurate, feel free to leave a comment amending that. And other than that, if you enjoyed this, you know, feel free to like and subscribe, I guess. And I will more than likely make more videos not only with this PC, but with other PCs, because I have a lot of hardware lying around in my basement, and it was actually a lot of fun putting this video together. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you around.